Go back, talk about some of the characteristics of the Western world. This should be especially important for those who missed the first part of the course. We've been studying the West since civilization first arose, roughly 5,500 years ago, and now we're trying to zero in on some of the specific developments of the last 500 years. If we were to try and define or characterize what we consider the West, one of the things we might note are the idea of rational scientific inquiry, that the West has long believed that man's mind is able of rationally understanding the world about him, applying reason to the world, using science, especially in the 20th century. The developments of technology show this. And this is kind of an ongoing development, ongoing progression in the West, this use of science to explain the world around him. And in this part of the course, you're going to see one of the first things we talk about is the scientific revolution, when suddenly in the 16th century, man rediscovered science as a tool, particularly the work of Copernicus and the astronomers and everything. And from that, science has become an increasingly important part of the Western world. Another characteristic or trait of the West, we consider the idea of individual freedom. In the first part of the course, I explained how this idea of individual freedom was founded on the three bedrocks of the Hebrews, the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Romans in different ways. On that bedrock, this idea was kind of put. It lasted. With the Renaissance, it was rediscovered. And this rediscovery of humanism and everything, the dignity of man was very important. We ended with the Renaissance. In this part of the course, we begin with the Reformation, which further strengthened the individualism of the West, because, if anything, the major Protestant reformers like Martin Luther believed that every individual is his own priest. You don't need priests. You don't need intermediaries between a Christian and his God, but each Christian is his own priest. And this reinforced this idea of individual worth. And then at the same time, the development of capitalism, merit, advancement, you got ahead on individual achievement and wealth and everything, reinforced this. And so this individualism continued to be very important in the West. Some other things would be the idea of change. If you look at the Western world, the process of ongoing change is very striking. A process of ongoing, increasingly rapid change is even more striking. Until really the 1500s, for peasants and everything, nothing really had changed since ancient Rome. And actually things began to pick up in the 18th century. Agriculture began to change. In the 18th century, you had the early Industrial Revolution. And from the end of the 18th century on, you have this pattern of escalating change. Things change faster, 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 faster in the Western world. And this is obvious when you look at the modern world, the world around you, how quickly things change, how quickly technology changes. VCRs have appeared, CDs have appeared, the personal computer, all innovations within the last 10 or 15 years. Things change so much more faster than they did before. And another general characteristic or definition of the West would include the violent strain, also the fascination with irrationality, not only rational explanations of the world, but irrational explanations of the world and irrational explanations of man's behavior. In this part of the course, in Western Civ since 1500, there's a couple even more striking aspects of the course. And the first is that the most obvious thing is that Western Civ ceases to be Western Civ after the early 16th century. The West finally rediscovered the rest of the world by its voyages of exploration and also colonization. The West again became part of a global culture, a global environment, and the interplay was back and forth between these other cultures and the West. Since 1500, as a matter of fact, you can say that the world has been steadily shrinking in size. Because of technological change and everything, the real size of the world hasn't changed, but the interaction, the communications, and everything has made it a much smaller world. And the West becoming just a part, one small piece of that smaller world. And that's obvious if you see it became obvious in the 1960s when suddenly man reached outer space and man looked down on the globe and saw that, wow, everybody's living on this one little planet. You can't separate. Well, where's the West? Where's the East? Where's the South? And everything. It suddenly became very clear and obvious that it's all part of one global culture, global population-wise and everything. And that becomes obvious in this part of the course, something that was different than in the first part of the course. The second point I'd like to make about this half of Western Civ is that the history becomes, intellectual history especially, becomes one of a series of isms. And I've jotted down some of these isms that I could come up with last night. For example, rationalism, deism, romanticism, industrialism, realism, impressionism, naturalism, Darwinism, expressionism, social Darwinism, racism, imperialism, existentialism, ism, one after another in our history in the last couple hundred years. What that shows us is that Western man is enormously creative. He continually comes up with these intellectual synthesis, new intellectual viewpoints on the world around him and on his relationship to the world. On the other hand, it shows that Western man's search for an explanation of his place in the world still is going on, and he hasn't really solved that problem yet. So he's still looking for a different way to put himself into that picture and everything. That'll be very obvious in the course, especially in Weber's lectures, all these isms, one after another. And don't get confused by them all and everything. Just remember it's part of this ongoing intellectual evolution. Part of that intellectual evolution is a very curious process that Weber doesn't really touch on much in his lectures. But if you look at intellectual trends in the West from roughly the 18th century to the present, one of the immediate things that you see about that is that there's a general swing between rational and irrational explanations of the world around them. And let me just give you a brief example of this. The Enlightenment of the 18th century focused on man's ability to explain man scientifically, rationally. Everything about the Enlightenment was rational, logical explanation of the world and man's behavior. The Enlightenment led partly to the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, you could say the dominant intellectual trend was Romanticism, which was an irrational explanation of the world, man, and nature, focusing on man's soul, man's feeling to nature, nature's beauty and everything. Romanticism was followed by roughly positivism. We could say in positivism dealt with, again, a scientific understanding of the world, scientific explanation using positive facts to explain the world, and the application of technology to shape the world. Positivism was followed by Freud. Freud, one of the great irrational thinkers of the modern age, said that man is driven by subconscious sexual drives. You have no control over what you're doing. Everything is in the back of your mind somewhere. So what for your rational, logical mind? It's your irrational, illogical mind that's driving things and everything. Back and forth throughout intellectual history is this swing between man's desires for a logical or an illogical understanding of the world. And you'll kind of get an idea of that from the lectures, and we're not going to go into much detail, but I hope you kind of remember that from this course. The other immediately recognizable aspect of modern West is violence. In fact, one of my professors at UVA used to call the 20th century the century of megadeath, because you're dealing with millions and millions and millions and millions of people dead. World War II, 60 million dead, roughly. We have no exact idea. 60 million dead. World War I, millions and millions and millions of dead. Iraq, Iran, hundreds of thousands of people dead. One of the problems with this is that it's very hard to teach World War II because I tell my students the Soviet Union lost 20 million people, and it makes no effect on them whatsoever, because when you're talking about mega numbers like this, the personal tragedy is completely lost. When you lose a close relative or anything, you immediately experience that personal tragedy, and you realize how bad and shattering death can be. But when you talk about 20 million people, there's no way you can imagine that and everything. So one of the weird things about the 20th century is that these numbers, these huge casualties, dehumanize man in a way, because you no longer worry or you no longer feel what all those deaths meant and everything. So in a way, for me, it tells us two things. It tells us, first of all, that when it comes to violence, 20th century man is real no different than the Romans. The Romans lived with violence all around them. The Roman world was nasty, short, and nasty, brutish, violent, and everything. They lived with it. 20th century man lives with the same sort of environment. And it also, again, kind of establishes this myth, a myth of great numbers. These numbers become meaningless when we're studying history and everything, and it makes it very difficult to get an impression of it. And it also, in a way, kind of twisting Winston Churchill's words around, reinforces this idea that man is this enigma. You can't really figure him out, with all these deaths. The last thing I want to say about this part of the course is that true in the last couple centuries in the West, a number of nations have been able to establish constitutional regimes with the defense of political liberties, individual rights, and everything. This has not gone altogether smoothly. It's still in process. But one of the things I want you to remember is that the very ideals of the French Revolution, there's a certain problem at work there. And liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity, the three ideals, the three giants of the Western world, really don't necessarily go together. There's a certain fundamental contradiction between liberty, equality, and fraternity. And every time I try and get to the root of that contradiction, I get all screwed up again and everything, and I get myself confused and everything. But I'll try and give you some idea of what that contradiction is. For example, how do you ensure the equality of men if liberty gives each man the right to make his own fortune, the process of which may make other men unequal? You can't really have equality yet liberty at the same time, because they conflict with each other. So which is it going to be? Are you going to ensure equality, or are you going to ensure personal liberty? Are you going to have a regulated economy, or are you going to have laissez-faire capitalism where everybody is free to make his own fortune at the expense of anybody else? How do you ensure the brotherhood of man, fraternity, if each man is an individual and has the liberty to reject that brotherhood and wants to live outside of that brotherhood? How do you fit the two of them together? Everything. It's great to talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity, but how do you implement? How do you put them into practice? And this is one of the fundamental problems that have confronted Western men, and this is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of revolutions. This was at the root of the Russian Revolution. It was an attempt to immediately implement these ideals, but it was an attempt to fail because it placed its emphasis on a different perspective. But each country, each culture within the West tries to implement these conflicting ideas in different measures with different emphasis and everything. And that's partly one of the reasons why the Western political experience is so diverse, because each different people chooses its own different way.